31 years on, the families of those killed in the Mount Erebus disaster have visited Antarctica for the first time. Air New Zealand Flight 901 crashed into the mountain during a snowstorm in 1979.
On a calm day, a simple sightseeing flight headed toward the most distant place on Earth. Passengers expected stunning ice, point white scenery, and a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Instead, the aircraft disappeared into Antarctica's cold silence, leaving fear, loss, and unanswered doubts behind. What looked like open sky concealed a deadly trick, a mountain hidden inside endless white. When investigators later looked closer at the evidence, the truth felt disturbing. How could a modern airliner fly straight into emptiness? And what had been hiding in plain sight the entire time? Join us in this video as we reveal the details. The flight that vanished into Antarctica. In 1979, Air New Zealand Flight 901 departed on what was supposed to be a calm and carefully controlled sightseeing journey. The flight was not meant to land anywhere near Antarctica. It was designed only to fly over the frozen continent, give passengers a clear view of the landscape below, and then return safely home. There were 257 people on board, including passengers, pilots, engineers, cabin crew, and a guide who explained what could be seen from the windows. Antarctica had become a place of curiosity and wonder. Very few people had ever seen it in person, and even fewer had experienced it from the air. These flights were marketed as safe, peaceful adventures. Champagne was served, cameras were ready. Passengers trusted that every detail had been planned with care. What many did not understand was how unforgiving Antarctica truly is. It is not simply cold. It is dangerous in ways that cannot always be seen. There are no airports to land at in an emergency. There are no nearby cities. Weather can change suddenly, and visibility can vanish without warning. In this environment, even small mistakes can become deadly. One of the most important details of any flight is the navigation route. The route tells pilots exactly where to fly and how high they must stay to avoid danger. For these sightseeing flights, the original route passed safely above Mount Erebus. Mount Erebus is a massive volcano that rises sharply out of the ice. It stands over 12,000 feet tall and dominates the surrounding landscape. When a new navigation computer system was introduced, the flight route had to be entered again. During this process, a small error was made. One coordinate was entered incorrectly by just 2 degrees. On paper, the mistake seemed minor. In reality, it shifted the flight path by many miles. Because of this error, the aircraft was no longer flying where everyone believed it was. Pilots who noticed the change assumed it had been approved. Flying over flat ice or frozen water seemed safer than flying near a volcano. The altered route also allowed aircraft to fly lower, giving passengers a better view. Over time, flying at lower altitude became common practice, and nothing went wrong. This created a false sense of safety. Captain Jim Collins and First Officer Gregory Casson were experienced pilots. They had thousands of flight hours and strong professional records. However, this was their first time flying the Antarctic sightseeing route. Their preparation for this unique environment consisted of a short simulator session that covered basic navigation and instruments. Only weeks before the flight, another pilot noticed that the route in the system did not match the original plan. He reported the issue. Unfortunately, the concern was misunderstood and not corrected properly. Then, just hours before Flight 901 departed, airline staff changed the route back to the original path over Mount Erebus. The most serious failure was not the change itself, but the lack of communication. The flight crew was never clearly told that the route had been altered. When they arrived for their early morning briefing, they believed they were flying the familiar path over McMurdo Sound at a lower altitude. As the aircraft flew south, everything seemed normal. The plane performed well. Passengers were relaxed and excited. Weather reports mentioned cloud cover and snow, but this was expected in Antarctica. Air traffic control later suggested the aircraft could descend lower for sightseeing once it reached the area. The crew decided to descend below the cloud layer so passengers could see the landscape and so they could visually confirm their position. This brought the aircraft below the officially approved minimum safe altitude. However, similar descents had happened before. and no one believed it was dangerous. As the aircraft continued downward, clouds thickened and snow filled the air. Outside the windows, the world turned white. The sky and the surface below blended together. This created a condition known as a sector whiteout. In this state, there are no shadows and no clear shapes. Depth and distance disappear. The crew believed they were flying over flat, ice-covered water. They did not know that the land beneath them was rising. At the same time, radio communication with ground control became unreliable and then stopped completely. Inside the cockpit, concern began to grow. The flight engineer questioned their position. Nothing below looked like McMurdo Sound. The crew discussed where Mount Erebus might be, but no one could see it. Visibility was nearly zero. Moments later, the ground proximity warning system activated. The alarm warned that the aircraft was dangerously close to terrain. There were only seconds to react. There was no time to climb away or turn. The aircraft struck the side of Mount Erebus at high speed. The impact was sudden and catastrophic. All 257 people on board lost their lives instantly. There was no distress call. No warning was sent. The aircraft disappeared into the mountain. At first glance, the flight appeared to vanish into Antarctica with no warning at all. But when investigators zoomed in on the route, weather, and final images, a terrifying reality emerged. The aircraft was flying straight toward a mountain hidden by snow and clouds. From afar, the land looked flat and safe. Up close, it was a deadly illusion that erased every chance to escape. If the crash itself happened in seconds, then what happened after the silence fell? And how did investigators begin to uncover the truth hidden beneath the ice? Let's delve deeper. After the silence came the questions. When contact with Flight 901 was lost, ground stations continued trying to reach the aircraft. No response came. Hours passed. When the plane failed to return and fuel limits were exceeded, it was officially declared missing. The following day, search teams were sent out into the Antarctic wilderness. The wreckage was found on the slopes of Mount Erebus. Investigators quickly determined that the crash was completely unsurvivable. The debris was scattered across ice and rock in a wide area. The location was remote, frozen, and extremely difficult to access. Recovery efforts were launched despite the harsh conditions. Teams of police officers, pathologists, dentists, and support staff traveled to the mountain. They lived in tents near the crash site for weeks. Temperatures were dangerously low. The winds were strong. Snow and ice made every task harder. Wildlife and weather created additional challenges. Even so, the recovery teams worked carefully and respectfully. Over time, they managed to recover and identify most of the victims. Their efforts were later recognized as acts of exceptional service and courage. As the nation mourned, people demanded answers. How could a modern aircraft crash into a known mountain? How could experienced pilots fly directly into rising terrain? Many felt the explanation offered at first did not make sense. The initial official investigation placed blame on the flight crew. It stated that the pilots had descended too low, were unsure of their position, and continued flying forward despite uncertainty. This conclusion caused anger and confusion among the public. Because of the widespread concern, a second investigation was launched. This inquiry looked deeper into how the flight was planned and managed. It found that the disaster was not the result of reckless flying, but of serious failures within the airline's systems. The investigation highlighted the incorrect navigation data, the last-minute route change, and the failure to inform the crew. It also pointed out that the dangers of whiteout conditions had not been clearly explained and that the flight briefing contained errors. These findings shifted responsibility away from the pilots and toward organizational mistakes. The disaster became a lesson in how small errors, poor communication, and assumptions can combine into a fatal chain of events. The loss of Flight 901 led to lasting changes in aviation safety. Navigation procedures were tightened. Flight briefings became more detailed. Communication standards improved. Airlines were forced to take greater responsibility for how information is shared with flight crews. What began as a peaceful sightseeing journey ended in one of the most devastating aviation disasters in history. The passengers never returned home, yet their loss changed aviation forever. The lessons learned from that day continue to protect lives, ensuring that such a tragedy is never repeated. If even experienced crews can lose contact and vanish into the vast unknown, how prepared are pilots when flying over one of the most hostile and unforgiving places on Earth? Let's find out. Flight preparations and crew readiness for Air New Zealand trip. On November 28, 1979, Air New Zealand Flight 901, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, was getting ready for a sightseeing trip over Antarctica. The flight began at Auckland Airport in New Zealand, with a planned stop in Christchurch to pick up more passengers for the journey. The flight had 5 crew members, but only 3 were in the cockpit at the time of departure. Captain Jim Collins, 45 years old, was in charge as the pilot. He had over 11,000 hours of total flying experience, including around 3,000 hours on the DC-10. Assisting him were 2 first officers. The first officer on the flight deck was Greg Casson, 37, who had flown nearly 8,000 hours in total and about 1,400 hours on the DC-10. The second first officer, Graham Neville Lucas, was part of the crew but was not in the cockpit during the flight. The flight engineer position was shared between 2 people because of a planned shift change during the flight. Nicholas John Maloney, with 1,700 hours of experience on the DC-10, started as the flight engineer. He left the seat partway through the trip so that Gordon Brooks could take over. Brooks had 3,000 hours of experience flying the DC-10. In addition to the flight crew, the plane carried 15 flight attendants responsible for passenger safety and service. The aircraft also had a flight commentator, Peter Mulgrew, 52, who acted as a tour guide. Mulgrew was an experienced mountaineer and Antarctic expert, providing information about the continent to passengers during the trip. Neither Captain Collins nor First Officer Casson had flown to Antarctica before. However, the pilots had been briefed on the flight plan 19 days before the trip. The briefing included a short film showing the route over McMurdo Sound. This briefing did not mention flying over Mount Erebus, even though other Air New Zealand pilots were aware of this feature on the Antarctic route. To prepare, 2 pilots attended a flight simulation course that focused on the special challenges of flying south of 60 degrees latitude. The course explained that navigation systems at these latitudes could be less accurate than normal. The pilots were trained to use the Inertial Navigation System, INS, which calculates the plane's position using gyroscopes and motion sensors. At that time, the INS was the main way pilots could navigate in areas with few or no radio navigation aids. The flight was scheduled to leave in the morning. At 8:17 a.m., the DC-10 departed Auckland Airport and headed to Christchurch, where more passengers would board. From there, the flight would continue south toward Antarctica. While the crew was skilled at flying the DC-10, they had little real-world experience with Antarctic conditions. They relied on the pre-flight briefing, simulator training, and the Antarctic expert on board to prepare for the unusual environment. Despite these measures, the combination of limited experience with Antarctic weather and terrain and reliance on older navigation technology would later contribute to the tragic outcome of the flight. In summary, Flight 901's preparation involved experienced crew members, careful planning, and additional support through briefing and simulation. The presence of an expert passenger provided extra guidance for sightseeing. However, the crew's lack of direct Antarctic experience, coupled with the limitations of 70s navigation equipment, left the flight at higher risk for misjudging its position over the icy continent. This preparation report highlights the steps taken before departure and the factors that affected the crew's ability to safely navigate in such an extreme and remote location. What could go wrong on what was meant to be a routine sightseeing flight over the pristine landscapes of Antarctica? Let's learn more. Antarctica awaits the promise and peril of Flight 901. Antarctica is one of the most extreme and unforgiving places on Earth. It is a land made almost entirely of ice and snow, with tall glaciers and frozen plains stretching as far as the eye can see. There are no trees, no shrubs, and almost no life compared to other continents. The weather is harsh and unforgiving. Winters bring total darkness, fierce winds, and freezing temperatures that can drop far below zero. Summers are slightly more bearable, with daylight lasting almost all day, but even then, the cold is ever present. For hundreds of years, Antarctica remained largely unexplored and mostly inaccessible. Only a few brave explorers and scientists dared to travel there, risking their lives to study its frozen terrain. Traveling to Antarctica by ship was a dangerous, long, and expensive journey, so only a few people had the chance to see it up close. This made the continent mysterious and fascinating to many around the world, a place that seemed untouchable and almost magical. By the 70s, modern airplanes and new technology began to make Antarctica more reachable for ordinary people. Airlines now had aircraft capable of flying long distances safely, even over remote and icy areas. New Zealand saw this as both an adventure and a business opportunity. They understood that people would pay to see the untouched beauty of Antarctica from the air. In the late 60s, the airline thought about using the Douglas DC-8 aircraft for sightseeing flights to the southern continent. However, the DC-8 was not powerful enough for such long flights and could not handle the unique conditions. The airline paused the plan and waited for a better aircraft. In 1973, Air New Zealand added the Douglas DC-10 to its fleet. The DC-10 was larger, stronger, and had a much longer range, making it ideal for flights to Antarctica. With this aircraft, sightseeing flights became possible. The first official Antarctic sightseeing flight took off in 1977. It was marketed as a luxurious experience, giving passengers a chance to fly over the frozen wilderness while enjoying first-class service, including champagne and gourmet meals. The views were breathtaking. People could see glaciers, snow-covered mountains, and the vast icy plains that had rarely been touched by humans. These flights quickly became very popular. Between 1977 and 1979, 14 flights had already taken place. Almost all were fully booked, and people were eager to pay for the chance to experience this rare adventure. The flights showed that with the right aircraft, proper planning, and skilled crews, it was possible to bring tourists safely to one of the most remote regions on the planet. It also demonstrated the commercial value of such trips, as ticket sales added a new source of revenue for the airline. However, despite the success of these flights, Antarctica remained a dangerous place. Flight 901, the 15th tour, would tragically prove this fact. After the crash, the world was shocked. The disaster was one of the deadliest aviation accidents in history. Immediate search and rescue operations, known as Operation Overdue, were launched. Teams of specially trained personnel flew to Antarctica to locate the wreckage and recover evidence and human remains. The crash site was extremely difficult to reach, with steep slopes, crevasses, and icy terrain. Weather conditions were harsh, with strong winds and low temperatures slowing down the work. Helicopters transported the wreckage, victims' remains, and critical flight data back to McMurdo Station and then to New Zealand for investigation. The incident highlighted how dangerous it could be to operate in such an extreme environment, and it led to widespread debate about airline safety, navigation procedures, and the responsibilities of commercial operators. Flight 901 remains a significant event in aviation history. It illustrates both the promise and the danger of human exploration, the limitations of technology, and the importance of communication and planning. While the Antarctic flights had opened up a new world to tourists, the disaster showed how unforgiving this frozen continent could be, even for the most prepared and skilled crews. When a flight sold as a safe and unforgettable Antarctic experience met hidden decisions made far from the cockpit, how did corporate failures turn promise into catastrophe at Mount Erebus? Keep watching for more. Corporate failures and the Mount Erebus disaster. Speaking about investigations of the Air New Zealand flight TE901 crash on 28 November 1979. The first official investigation, known as the Chippendale Report, blamed Captain Jim Collins for descending too low and not being sure of the plane's position. However, later investigations showed that the report did not fully examine the important mistakes made by Air New Zealand and its management, which played a major role in the disaster. One of the most serious issues was that the airline did not tell the pilots about a change to the plane's flight path. The approved coordinates for the flight had been adjusted the night before takeoff to fix a typing error that had gone unnoticed for over 2 years. This change shifted the flight path 27 miles east, putting the plane directly over Mount Erebus instead of the intended route over flat McMurdo Sound. The pilots, unaware of this update, followed the new coordinates, believing they were on the correct path. This mistake, combined with a visual illusion caused by whiteout conditions, made it impossible for the crew to see the mountain in time to avoid it. In July 1980, the New Zealand government appointed Justice Peter Mahone to lead a royal commission of inquiry. This inquiry was independent and broader than the first investigation. Mahone had the power to interview any Air New Zealand employee, flight operations staff, and government officials he thought could provide useful information. The goal was to find not just the immediate causes of the crash, but also any underlying problems within the airline and government oversight. Justice Mahone's inquiry found serious lapses in responsibility at Air New Zealand. The airline had failed to ensure the pilots were informed about the corrected flight path. The commission concluded that this lack of communication was a key factor in the crash. Evidence also suggested that the airline had tried to downplay its role and mislead the public in the days following the disaster. This created a perception of a cover-up and raised concerns about honesty and accountability in the airline and government. The findings emphasized that aviation disasters are often caused not just by human error, but by organizational and procedural failures. Accurate flight planning and clear communication with crews are essential to safety. The Royal Commission highlighted that ignoring these responsibilities can have deadly consequences. Public reaction to the report showed that people expect transparency and accountability from airlines and government bodies, especially after such a tragic event. The Royal Commission ultimately shifted the focus from blaming the pilots to examining systemic failures. The crash was primarily caused by the airline's errors in flight planning and its failure to inform the flight crew. The TE901 disaster serves as a warning about corporate negligence, poor communication, and the need for organizations to take full responsibility for safety. What happens when human ambition meets a land so cold, vast, and unforgiving that even the best preparations are pushed to their breaking point? Stay tuned for more. The struggle of survival in the frozen continent. Antarctica is one of the most harsh, cold, and unforgiving places on Earth. It is a land covered with ice and snow, where the wind is strong and the temperatures are extremely low. The continent is so vast and so empty that it has always challenged explorers, researchers, and travelers. Many people who have tried to go there have faced dangers that they could never have imagined before they arrived. Some expeditions were meant to explore and discover. Some were for science, and some were even just to see the beauty of the frozen land. But in all cases, the people who went there had to deal with the ice, the cold, and the weather that changes very quickly. This report describes several well-known incidents where people faced disasters in Antarctica, sometimes losing their lives, sometimes barely surviving, and sometimes suffering great hardships. One of the earliest expeditions was led by Sir Ernest Shackleton. Shackleton wanted to cross the continent from one side to the other. They set out with a ship called the Endurance, which was specially built to go through icy waters. For many months, the ship moved slowly through the ice, but eventually, the ice trapped the ship completely. The crew could not move, and they had to wait for the ice to release the ship. That did not happen, and the ship sank under the ice. The crew was left on the drifting ice with nowhere to go. Shackleton made a brave decision to take a small group on a journey across the ocean in a small boat. They traveled hundreds of miles in dangerous seas to reach a whaling station. After many days, they finally reached safety and returned to rescue the rest of their crew. Every single person survived, but they went through extreme cold, hunger, and fear. The expedition is remembered as a story of bravery and survival, but also as an example of how dangerous Antarctica can be. In later years, accidents continued to happen, even with modern technology. In one instance, a Canadian pilot was flying scientists to a research station. The flight was long, and the weather in Antarctica is very unpredictable. The plane never arrived at its destination. 2 days later, search teams found the remains of the aircraft in a snow-covered mountain area. The crash was so severe that there was no chance of survival. The bodies could not be recovered because the place was too dangerous to reach. Another serious event involved a small team of explorers who were traveling across East Antarctica. They were using a heavy vehicle called muskeg tractor. The terrain in Antarctica is filled with hidden crevices and deep cracks in the ice. As they moved forward, The vehicle suddenly fell into a deep crevice. One person died immediately. Others were trapped and injured. A team member tried to rescue them, but the conditions were so difficult that only partial rescue was possible. The ice was slippery, and the crevice was deep and dangerous. The people involved had to make life or death decisions very quickly, while facing extreme cold. In addition to accidents with vehicles and ships, the extreme cold and darkness of Antarctica have claimed the lives of scientists even at research stations. One scientist disappeared while walking between buildings in the snow. At first, search teams saw his trail, but the snow covered it quickly. The temperatures were far below zero, and the winds were strong. Despite using flares and floodlights, the search had to be called off after several days. The scientist was never found, and he was presumed dead. Even when expeditions were carefully planned, nature could be too powerful. Many crews had to survive by finding food in the ice, melting ice for water, and building temporary shelters. They waited for rescue for long periods. Some had to survive entire winters without proper food or warmth. In all these cases, survival required great skill, determination, and courage. Antarctica remains a place where even small mistakes can lead to serious consequences. After witnessing how early expeditions struggled just to survive Antarctica's relentless conditions, what happened when modern explorers, aircraft, and technology began facing the same frozen dangers? Let's take a closer look. Disasters from air, fire, and the frozen wastes. Antarctica is not only dangerous because of ice and cold. Accidents have also happened from the air and at research stations. One of the most tragic events occurred with a sightseeing flight over the continent. The plane was full of passengers who wanted to see the icy landscape. The crew believed they were flying over a safe area, but the navigation was wrong. They were actually headed directly toward an active volcano. The weather was bad, and the whiteout conditions made it impossible to see the mountain ahead. The plane crashed, and everyone on board died instantly. There was no way to recover the bodies safely because the mountain was too dangerous to climb. This tragedy showed that even modern planes and trained crews can face deadly risks in Antarctica. Fires have also caused disaster on the continent. At one Brazilian research station, a fire broke out in a machine room. The flames spread quickly because of strong winds and flammable materials inside the building. Most of the station's people were evacuated, but 2 members of the Navy lost their lives. Laboratories, living spaces, and scientific equipment were destroyed. Even small accidents can become deadly in Antarctica because the conditions make it very hard to respond quickly. Ships can also be trapped in the ice, even in modern times. A Russian research vessel became stuck in thick ice while carrying scientists, journalists, and tourists. The ice around the ship would not move, and the crew could not break free. The people on board had to wait for help. Icebreakers from China and Australia eventually arrived, and the passengers were airlifted to safety. The ship returned home once the ice moved enough for it to sail. These situations show that even strong ships cannot always overcome the power of the ice. Some of the oldest Antarctic expeditions ended in complete failure, despite careful planning. The Terra Nova expedition, led by Captain Robert Falcone Scott, tried to reach the South Pole. After a long and exhausting journey, the team finally reached the pole, only to find that another expedition had beaten them there. On the return journey, the men faced cold, exhaustion, and starvation. Scott and his 2 companions died in their tent, just a short distance from supplies that could have saved them. In all these cases, the frozen land, the weather, and the terrain were the main threats. Explorers, researchers, and travelers faced the reality that Antarctica is one of the most dangerous places on Earth. People who survived showed courage, determination, and skill. Others lost their lives due to accidents, navigational mistakes, sudden weather, or equipment failures. What do you think about Flight 901 that vanished into Antarctica? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you for joining us as we uncovered the tragic and mysterious story of Air New Zealand Flight 901 and its fatal journey into the frozen skies of Antarctica. If this deep dive helped shed light on what really happened and the questions that still linger, don't forget to like and subscribe. Click the next video on your screen to explore more haunting aviation mysteries and untold stories from history. We'll see you there.